over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are here in the John Hope Franklin Center, and we are joined today by Professor Kinohi Nishikawa, who is Assistant Professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton University, also a Duke alumni. He's the author of the new book, Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction and the Making of a Literary Underground. How are you doing, Kinohi?
I'm doing great. It's fantastic to be
Welcome
back
back to Duke.
Thank you.
And I'll begin there. You're returning to Duke as part of a lecture series.
It's a tremendous honor to come back to Duke as part of a series celebrating 50 years of African and African American Studies at the university. For us graduate students, the department's interdisciplinary formation served as a model for how to think across field parameters about research, writing, and perhaps most important, undergraduate teaching.
Talk a little bit, particularly given the fact that you are teaching in an African American Studies department. This is your field of research. Talk a little bit about how important Black Studies has been for you as a scholar and a thinker.
Yeah. Well, AAAS at Duke really was a kind of intellectual home for me outside of the department from which I earned my PhD.
Literature department.
Literature department, exactly. Two key figures, Juanima Lubiano and Grant Farid, who were in literature, also had connections to AAAS. Right. And it was through taking courses with Juanima and really just getting to know Grant and learning really about Black diaspora studies from him that set me on the path to seeing AAAS as a home for what I wanted to do. As I developed my interest in popular reading practices among African Americans, I then saw the department as a way to really test out ideas that I couldn't necessarily do in literature. So over the time that I was here at Duke, AAAS really introduced me to students and graduate students, undergrads and grads, who really were my primary audience for testing ideas that eventually became the book.
Your book is about Black pulp fiction. Talk a little bit about what that is. I mean, particularly in this kind of moment where we're getting away from traditional reading practices, there's something almost nostalgic about this idea of Black pulp fiction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad the book is out now because it kind of intersects with the Dolemite craze, the rediscovery of Rudy Ray Moore and Dolemite. But it's an apt connection because the culture from which Dolemite sprang is the culture that also produced readers for Black pulp fiction. We're talking a kind of street level, working class, Black popular reading practice that largely flew under the radar of mainstream, to say nothing
Published
of.
now, they had no idea this reading public even existed.
No idea. No idea.
And this is 50 years before Ta-Nehisi Coates.
That's right. That's right. So the project really was a way of how do you reconstruct histories of that reading practice, that reading public, which in many ways was a counter-public. Precisely because mainstream publishers, to say nothing of universities, knew anything about them. So I spent the better part of a decade reconstructing those reading practices, and that's the story of the book.
The names that folks should know, but the names that really frame this particular historical moment in Black literature: Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines, right?
Absolutely.
Who are these men, right? And why were they so influential? Because there are a whole generation who might not have read Donald Goines, right? Might have heard Iceberg Slim, but of course both of them get resonated, right? Recaptured, if you will, a generation later within hip hop. So who were these two men?
Absolutely. Slim, who he had a complicated history, but Slim was Robert Beck before he became Iceberg Slim. He was a former hustler and pimp who in the mid-1960s thought it was a good idea to write really a memoir of his days hustling in the industrial Midwest. So we're talking Chicago, Milwaukee, places like this. So even though Pimp comes out in 1967, it's really looking back
Right.
to his
50s,
youth
right.
and
40s and 50s,
really
yeah.
growing up during the Depression
Yeah.
era. And it's a really kind of visceral, lusty, brash
Right.
account of a black man's coming of age.
It's Blaxpoitation on the page, right?
It's Blaxpoitation on the page. And given the period before Blaxpoitation.
Right,
I mean, it's Blaxpoitation avant la lettre. So that's what really made it stand out. And, Slim himself is kind of a persona. Yeah. He hyperbolizes aspects of his biography for the book, as I think many memoirists do. But that really resonated for an audience in the late 60s and certainly early 70s who were looking for strong black male characters in literature.
Right. Anti-heroes.
Anti-heroes
Yeah.
who didn't kind of toe a kind of Poitier-esque respectability line, who, let's be honest, performed a kind of black masculinity mainly for white audiences, and so as not to raise their hackles. Slim's persona in his book Pimp was not that. And there was something refreshingly, kind of anti-heroic about his ability to embrace that eye, to embrace that sense of being a bad man that readers found absolutely appealing.
Yeah.
Goins,
who many people think of as a much more serious writer.
That's right. Yes. Goins actually gets his start by reading Slim while he's locked up.
Right.
And decides to send Slim's publisher, a small outfit in LA called Holloway House.
And we'll talk about them in a moment.
It was certainly, yes. The book, really is in some ways a kind of biography of Holloway House, not just of these two figures. But Goins submits a manuscript over the transom to Holloway House, and they recognize, a son of Iceberg Slim in terms of influence.
Right.
In terms of influence. And Goins, really, toward the end of his release, and then upon his release, finds a publisher in Holloway House, and then keeps publishing. Keeps putting them out. Right. His Pulp Fiction, titles like Whoreson, titles like Dope Fiend, Black Girl Lost, is grittier, if you can even imagine it. And in some ways more hard-boiled than Slim. Now Slim was hard-boiled, but a lot of his appeal came with a kind of a wink and a nudge.
Yeah, right.
There was a kind of trickster aspect to it that you almost felt like he was playing with your expectations as a reader. Right. Goins didn't care about that. He really went for the jugular. And his Pulp Fiction is pretty unsparing in terms of its depictions of inner city life, in terms of its depiction of drug use, the heroin trade, gun running, mafia, right? I mean, classic themes, but the way he depicted it in sort of the blighted inner city took it to the extreme. So Goins has a very productive career in the early 70s. And it really started from his reading Slim, but saying he wanted to do something different.
There's a way in when we think about these publications, right? And they were published by this publisher, Holloway House. And we'd like to believe that Holloway House was like, we want to help black folks find their voice in the culture. But that was not nearly the case. Talk a little bit about what Holloway House was.
Yeah. Holloway House has a history before it started publishing black pulp fiction. And the book I wrote takes a look at that history in a way that no other scholar or journalist or critic has done before. That history is rooted in 1950s white male pinup and erotic fiction culture. This was a company whose magazine arm, and it really started off as a pinup magazine venture, catered to a kind of down market taste for pinups and risque kind of, girly magazines.
Right. And to put this in some sort of context, it was not as upscale as Playboy or even Hustler might have been, Larry Flint's operation in the 70s. Right?
Would have been even more, right. We would have been classier than some of this stuff. No, that's why I say down market. The kind of taste formation was avowedly working class and embracing of the lumpen. So that happens in the 50s. The pinup magazines naturally lead to a paperback arm because, during this time, there was very little separating cheap pinup magazines and cheap paperbacks. The distribution mechanisms were the same. That was the key. So they start Holloway House really to reprint fiction and salacious news stories that had come out in the magazines.
Okay.
The publishing arm, the paperback publishing arm, is doing business for most of the decade. And really, it's Slim's arrival on the scene that directs them to a completely new way of thinking about their readership. Listen, prior to Iceberg Slim, they had no interest in targeting magazines or books to black readers. They were after profits, and their market was working class white men. The guys who come home from the factory and want just a cheap thrill.
And their wives aren't necessarily interested in providing that thrill, so...
The classic stuff for the attic, right? The stuff you put away in the attic after. So it's Slim, along with a few other writers in the late 60s, who, although initially marketed to white men, because that was the existing, business model, eventually pointed them to the power of black readers.
We talk about Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines, but one of their most notorious books that came out in this era is a book called The Nigger Bible.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about, and I remember first reading, it was actually in Robin Kelly's Race Rebels. That I first heard about this. I'm like, what? Talk a little bit about the Nigger Bible.
So this is an interesting text that I do write about in the book. That book is, along with Pimp, these are the two texts that alert Holloway House to the importance of the black readership. And the author's got an interesting name. His name is Robert Decoy, D-E-C-O-Y. And there's a really funny black nationalist review of the book that says, because, pulp and pinup trades, pseudonyms are a dime a dozen, that says, we looked into this Robert Decoy to see if he's the real deal, and it turns out that's his real name. So even though his last name is Decoy, it happened to be his birth name. This is a kind of extraordinary text that Holloway House reprints, because part of my research for Street Players discovered that Decoy had actually printed this, had actually published it on his own, and sold it on the streets of LA before Holloway House then reprints it. And it is a kind of alternate theology for blackness that echoes a lot of what Eldridge Cleaver would come to say in Soul on Ice.
And this is something that I thought about, because what year is Pimp published?
67.
67. Soul on Ice comes out in 68. I'm hard-pressed to not think that both Cleaver and his publisher were not thinking about. They had to have been thinking about the success of this Pulp Fiction when he writes Soul, because Soul on Ice reads like black Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the chapter from Soul on Ice, the notorious chapter, let's be honest, the primeval mitosis, which establishes a kind of alternate, really, theology of black male, white female sexual relations
right.
is something that is, foreseen, if not predicted by Robert DeCoy's work. It's all there.
Yeah.
It's all there, and it's 200 plus pages, and he really goes in deep. There are also elements of Baldwin in that book, in terms of the way he's addressing his children, Robert DeCoy.
Right.
So it's a kind of lost classic of 60s black literature, but it kind of makes sense because it was pulp, right? It never got out of a pulp format, so it never gained the kind of attention that a Baldwin or a Cleaver did.
You talk about a black literary underground, and there are ways in which we could talk about this now, and we would think about Nigger Bible and Donald Goines alongside, someone like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Baldwin, of course, these kind of folks. Yeah. That wasn't necessarily the case when these books came out. And I would dare argue that when you start doing research on this book as a dissertation, there had to have been some pushback about whether or not this literary underground was worthy of the kind of energy and attention that you eventually pay to it in Street Players. Absolutely.
It's when I first landed on this topic in the mid-2000s, the feeling was sort of like, it's almost like this kind of Henry Louis Gates thing where it's like, we just established our canon. Now you want to blow it up, undercut it with the stuff that, even though it existed, it's kind of not the thing you want to necessarily be teaching all the time. We just got here, right? So that risk was real, but the key for me was always the question of readership. And in some ways that sustained, my early career.
And you can't dismiss that, right? That's the part of the conversation that, with all the questions about black literacy and who's reading what you actually have is a public here who's committed to reading, right? And so what do we do with this?
Exactly. And that sustained me, and if you frame the project and you frame, different chapters around that question, I think people get it. Because it always leads me to show how the underground is sort of in the background of what other writers, sort of writers are that we would teach, that we would study more regularly, are thinking about or are writing. So it's kind of in the background in a way that I think needs to be recognized, which is why one of the more important parts of the book shows when Larry Neal, the great black arts theorist and poet, writes a poem in response to Iceberg Slim's popularity among black readers. It's one of these marginal details that shows you that black arts was thinking about Paul.
They were paying attention to them. Right?
They were paying attention
to them. Right.
And that in and of itself tells you a lot about the formation of black literature in the late 60s and early 70s.
I mean, you think about the work that sustains Chester Himes.
That's right, yeah.
Right, not the great literary works, but the stuff that's in the detective novels, right? Exactly. It's the same audience that's reading, Iceberg Slim, that's reading Chester Himes, right? Absolutely. That's going to see Cotton Comes to Harlem and Come Back Charleston Blue in the theaters.
Exactly right. And fortunately for me, a scholar like the literary historian Lawrence Jackson, who's been studying Himes for years and has written the definitive biography of him, he too can see how Himes had this sort of underground connection, in part because American readers, white readers, weren't ready for his protest fiction.
Right.
So he says, you know what?
let me make some money. Right.
That's right. Let me make some money, and let me write hard-boiled pulp that turns out to kind of do its own Afro-surrealist thing. But nonetheless, the formation was a kind of pulp sensibility.
Where is Iceberg Slim's audience in 2019? What are they reading?
They are reading, I would venture to say, urban fiction. I think urban fiction, alternately known as street lit, hip-hop lit, is kind of the modern day descendant of classic black pulp fiction from the 60s and 70s. These are books mainly written by black women, though not exclusively,
Right.
for primarily black women readers. And this is one of the biggest changes we see in popular literary tastes, i.e. the racial underground, from the 60s to the 2010s, and that is you see a lot more black women reading pulp, sort of urban romance.
The Coldest
things of that
Winter,
nature.
right? The Sister
Coldest
Soldier
Winter ever,
phenomenon.
right? Really laid the groundwork for
Right.
this, as did someone like Omar Tyree,
Uh-huh.
Fly Girl.
Uh-huh.
These were the sort of 90s books that
James
sort of
Hardy.
James Hardy, yeah.
Right.
These were the sort of 90s books that really set the template that said, you know, readers of urban fiction don't just have to be black men and black boys. They can be black women and black girls too. And that market has truly taken off
Right.
over the past 20 to 25 years.
What's next for you, Kinohi?
I am working on a book tentatively titled Black Paratext. And it's a book on the history of 20th century African American literature and book design. The ways in which texts, both classic and marginal, have been designed by various publishers, marketers, graphic artists over the years. And what I look at is individual titles in history, in other words, when they appeared in history, and then crucially, this is very important, individual titles over time as they're reprinted.
Okay.
So the 52 Invisible Man with the
Right.
famous modernist cover, how does Ellison's novel then get reprinted over the decades
Right.
to reflect changing times and
That's
readerships?
interesting, yeah. We've been joined by Professor Kinohi Nishikawa, who's an assistant professor, soon to be associate professor, of English and African American Studies at Princeton. He's the author of Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction, and the Making of a Literary Underground, published by the University of Chicago Press. Thank you for joining us, Kinohi.
Thank you, Mark.
All T's, all black, cause at the top is Barack, and a stack of all black jeans, cause I'm never gonna slack. Black boy shorts on my ass, like teachers stay on short. Black boys in class, so they grow to lead the masses. Black sunglasses, cause my future bright. Molasses, Blackberry, write my rhymes in them every night, they scary. Black scarves, represent scars and nooses that they hung us by, but now they hanging on my word, deuces. Yo, too black to not be a fan of Michael Jack. Word, the Bible colors all black, just like my